She could hear them before she saw them, a storm of voices on the other side of the studio wall, electric, ravenous, rising in waves that made the floor vibrate. They were chanting her name, but not for who she was. They were chanting for the miracle they believed she had become. Oprah tightened her grip on the waistband of the size 10 Calvin Klein jeans, pulling, forcing, willing them to rise over a body that had not eaten solid food in 128 days. Her fingers trembled. Her breath came shallow. Even lifting her foot to push through the denim felt like wading through thick water. Hunger had its own gravity.
A stylist hovered nearby, fussing with the hem of her sweater, trying not to stare at the sweat beading at her hairline. Oprah didn't tell her she felt faint. She didn't mention the black specks forming at the edges of her vision. She didn't say she'd woken up that morning with a pulse slow enough to scare a nurse. She simply took another breath, shallow and disciplined, and forced the zipper closed. This was the smallest size she had ever worn in her adult life, a size the world told her she could never reach, a size she had bled, starved, prayed, and bargained her way into. The jeans were a trophy, but they were also a prison.
Someone knocked on the dressing room door. 2 minutes, Oprah. Her name, spoken with that tone, the tone that came from producers when they sensed history about to happen, felt almost foreign. The name belonged to the woman the world worshipped. It did not belong to the woman staring into the mirror now, cheeks hollow enough to betray the cost of the last 4 months. In the reflection, she saw the outline of her own ribs beneath the sweater. She had not seen them since she was a child. The irony tasted bitter. She had spent her life trying to escape hunger. Now, hunger was the only thing keeping her crown in place. She reached for the edge of the table to steady herself. The room swayed like a ship fighting tidewater. Somewhere deep inside, a small, frightened voice whispered, "You shouldn't be standing." But another voice, the older one, the voice that had survived Mississippi, Milwaukee, Nashville, answered back, "You don't have the luxury of falling. Not today." She turned toward the red wagon weight in the corner. 67 pounds of animal fat, molded and piled in pale, obscene lumps. The exact amount she had lost. The exact number that made the studio audience gasp when they heard it. The producer said the wagon would make great television. Oprah understood what they meant. It would make great spectacle. She crouched, slow and careful, gripped the wagon handle, and pulled it toward her. Even the slight effort made the room flicker again. The wheels squeaked. The fat glistened under the fluorescent light. This was what the world truly wanted from her today. Not wisdom, not empathy, not the human depth she had carved her career from. Today they wanted proof. Physical proof that she had disciplined her body into something palatable for mass consumption. They wanted a miracle they could measure. She straightened, placed a hand against her stomach, and held herself upright. Her heartbeat fluttered like a trapped bird. She closed her eyes, whispered something only she would ever hear, and reached for the doorknob. When she stepped into the wings of the stage, the heat hit her first. Studio lights always felt like judgment, bright enough to erase imperfections, hot enough to punish anything fragile. The audience's roar grew louder, a furnace of approval. She felt none of it. There was a moment, just one breath, in which she thought about turning around, walking out of the studio, collapsing into the nearest chair, and sleeping for a week, a month, until her bones remembered what it felt like to be fed. But history waited, and she had always walked toward history, even when she was shaking. She stepped into the light. The first thing she saw was the shock, thousands of eyes widening at once as they took in her new body. The sweep of her waist, the sharp line of her jaw, the silhouette no one believed she could ever possess. The second thing she saw was hunger, not hers, but theirs. It was the hunger of a culture that worshipped thinness as righteousness, the hunger of people who needed her transformation to mean something about themselves, the hunger that said, if Oprah can do it, maybe I can. If she can starve herself into beauty, maybe there is hope for me too. They were starving for her story. She was starving. Literally. Oprah smiled, careful and deliberate, because collapse was not allowed here. She took a step forward and pulled the wagon behind her. Gasps broke open like fireworks around the studio. 67 pounds of fat, 3 months of liquid meals, a lifetime of judgment condensed into a single moment of applause. The wagon rolled across the stage like a symbol of conquest, but she felt none of the triumph. Her legs trembled beneath the denim. Her throat was dry. Her stomach shrank into itself like a fist. They were screaming for her discipline, for her transformation, for her suffering. She knew that if she fainted right there on the carpet, they would edit around it and still call the episode a success. In her smile, there was both pride and grief, because the truth was brutal. They were not cheering for her mind, the mind that had survived unspeakable childhood pain. They were not cheering for her empathy, the empathy that had changed countless lives. They were not cheering for her genius. They were cheering because she looked smaller. The applause washed over her in crashing waves, but she felt nothing but the ache of emptiness inside her belly, a hollow so deep it felt almost spiritual. She steadied herself again, gripping the wagon handle like a lifeline. The cameras zoomed in. Millions watched. The country buzzed. This was supposed to be a victory, and yet, beneath the makeup and the designer jeans, beneath the applause and the spectacle, she felt a quiet truth gnawing through the hunger. She had never been farther from herself. She had never been lonelier. She had never been more afraid that the world loved a version of her that was killing her. Later, people would say it was the greatest moment of her career. Later, magazines would call it iconic. Later, America would replay it as a symbol of discipline and success. But inside the woman in those 2 small jeans was a whisper the world could not hear. The world thought they were looking at a queen, but underneath the jeans, she was just a hungry ghost. To understand how she arrived at this moment of starvation and spectacle, we must go back. Before the wagon, before the empire, before the world knew her name, there was just a young woman in Baltimore, holding on to hope the way some people carry heirlooms, carefully, protectively, as if it might fracture under the wrong kind of gaze. It was 1976, and the city smelled of industry and ambition. The news station, WJZ-TV, stood like a promise waiting to be tested. For a young black woman from Nashville, it was more than a job. It was the door she had spent her life knocking on. The lobby hummed with phones, typewriters, shoes clicking across tile. People moved with a kind of urgency that suggested truth itself was always slipping away and had to be chased down with microphones. Oprah felt the weight of that urgency as she entered the newsroom. She had made it. She had fought her way here from the farm, the poverty, the shame, the wounds no one had seen. This was supposed to be the beginning of her becoming. But Baltimore had its own script for her. She sat at the news desk for the first time with makeup settling into the soft lines of her face, camera lights burning hot on her skin. The teleprompter scrolled. She breathed in, and she began to read the world. It unraveled almost immediately. Her voice wavered where it should have been steel. Phrases tripped where they should have landed like verdicts. Sentences that demanded neutrality instead awakened something too human inside her. When news of tragedy appeared on the prompter, fires, shootings, families torn apart, her voice thickened. She could not perform the polished indifference that the industry required. Tears gathered, too honest, too real, betraying her in front of the very people she was meant to impress. In the control room, she could almost feel the producers shifting uncomfortably, hands hovering over buttons, eyes narrowing. Emotion was weakness. Empathy was unprofessional. Tears were unforgivable. She had brought all 3 with her. The station tolerated her at first. New talent needs time, they said. She will adjust. She will learn to harden. But she did not harden. She couldn't. The same instincts that would one day make her the most trusted voice in America were the very instincts that made her a terrible news anchor. Still, she tried to mold herself into the version of success the newsroom demanded. That was when the hair disaster happened. Someone had suggested a new look, A softer curl, something camera-friendly. She agreed, not out of vanity, but out of a desire to belong. The perm was applied, chemicals burned. A stylist smiled and said it looked perfect, but the days that followed felt like watching erosion in real time. Strands loosened, hair gathered on combs, pillows, shower drains. She tried to hide it, but how do you hide humiliation that grows more visible every morning? One day, a coworker joked about it in the hallway. She laughed politely, pretending the joke didn't land in the pit of her stomach. But the truth was simple. She was losing her hair, and she was losing her grip on Baltimore. Her confidence fractured. Every broadcast felt like walking onto a stage made of ice, one slip away from collapse. And eventually, the collapse came. It was delivered not with cruelty, but with a quiet professionalism that felt even colder. They told her the news program wasn't working out. They told her they needed someone with a steadier tone, a firmer presence, a cleaner read. They told her she would be moved to a new assignment, a morning show, a local talk program few people watched, a place where producers put personalities they didn't know what to do with, a career graveyard. People are talking, they said. It sounded almost mocking. Oprah nodded. She did not cry, not because she wasn't devastated, but because devastation was too familiar to surprise her anymore. The first morning she walked onto the talk show set, something inside her felt numb. The studio was smaller, the lighting softer, the chairs more comfortable than the stiff news desk had ever allowed. She sat in one of them with the posture of someone expecting another failure. Then the first guest walked out. She wasn't a politician or a bureaucrat. She wasn't a headline. She was a human being with a story, trembling slightly as she took the seat beside Oprah. There was no teleprompter dictating how to respond, no script instructing her to remain detached. For the first time in years, Oprah exhaled. She leaned toward the woman, instinctive, gentle, listening with her whole body. The interview unfolded not as performance, but as conversation, one person reaching toward another. Oprah asked questions without worrying if they were polished. She laughed when the guest laughed. She softened when the guest's voice broke. She allowed herself to feel without fear. A strange sensation crept through her. Recognition. Not of the guest, but of herself. She had been performing the wrong role all along. By the time the episode ended, producers were watching her differently. Not with impatience, but with interest. The phones rang a little more. Viewers wrote letters. Something was happening, quiet, slow, but undeniable. This wasn't news. This wasn't anchoring. This wasn't the job she thought she wanted. This was breathing. Each day on the show, she felt the shape of her true voice emerging, warm, intuitive, unafraid of emotion. Guests responded. Audiences leaned in. Stories that might have drowned in the news found oxygen in her presence. Her demotion became a door. Her failure became a foundation. And the woman who had once been told she was too emotional for journalism began to realize something astonishing. Emotion was not her flaw. Emotion was her gift. She did not know it yet, but Baltimore had cracked her open so that something larger could enter, something destined, something that would one day shift the gravity of daytime television. She was being carved by rejection into the shape of the woman she would become. And though the world hadn't noticed it yet, Oprah Winfrey had just taken her first breath in the life she was born for. But destiny rarely stays in small rooms. Chicago entered her life like a dare whispered into a storm. A city of steel and wind, carved by ambition and divided by history, it rose on the horizon as both a warning and a promise. In 1984, when the offer came to host a struggling morning show called AM Chicago, Oprah was no longer the uncertain young woman Baltimore had broken. She had found her rhythm on the talk show stage, discovered the strange, magnetic pull of human connection. But Chicago was not Baltimore. Chicago was an empire, and empires already had their king. His name was Phil Donahue. He was tall, polished, immaculate, a man who dominated daytime television with a confidence that seemed welded into his bones. He had the ratings, the power, the national recognition. He was the blueprint, and nobody, certainly not a black woman from the South, was expected to challenge him. In the industry's quiet hallways, the murmurs traveled like cold drafts. Don't go. Chicago will eat her alive. She won't stand a chance. Even people who loved her hesitated. Why trade stability for a battlefield? Why risk humiliation on a stage built for someone else? But Oprah had learned something essential during her time in Baltimore, that safety was never where she grew. Growth lived in the wilderness, in the places where no one expected her to survive. Chicago felt like that wilderness, and beneath her fear was the old, familiar whisper, a voice she had carried since Mississippi, since Milwaukee, since Nashville. You are meant for more.
She packed her bags. When she arrived at WLS-TV, she was greeted with polite skepticism. Executives shook her hand with the soft pressure of people who reserve judgment until the numbers come in. The studio smelled of cold coffee and freshly painted optimism. The set was dated. The ratings were dismal. AM Chicago was not just failing, it was sinking without ceremony, sliding down the Nielsen charts toward oblivion. She took her first walk onto the set quietly, almost reverently. The chairs were stiff, the walls beige, the cameras older than the station wanted to admit. But none of that mattered. She understood that a show's soul was not in its furniture, it was in its heartbeat, and a heartbeat came from the host. Yet even she, confident as she was becoming, felt the weight of the city pressing against her ribs. Chicago was not waiting for her. Chicago did not need her. Chicago watched her with folded arms. The first morning she went live, there was a storm in her chest, a collision of dread and defiance. Viewers tuned in expecting nothing. Some expected failure. Some didn't bother expecting at all. But as soon as the cameras signaled the start, Oprah leaned forward, and something familiar rose inside her. The instinct to see, to hear, to touch the truth in another person. She wasn't polished. She wasn't rehearsed. She wasn't perfect. She was real. On her second day, she abandoned the pre-written questions. On the third, she laughed with a guest until tears gathered in the corners of her eyes. On the fourth, she ate food on air, sampling dishes with a kind of uninhibited delight no producer could stage manage. There was no distance between her and the people watching. She wasn't performing for them. She was breathing with them. Chicago had never seen anything like it. Old television rules began to crumble around her. Hosts weren't supposed to touch guests. She hugged them. Hosts weren't supposed to cry. She wept when someone's story pierced her heart. Hosts weren't supposed to break the invisible glass between the stage and the audience. She shattered it daily. Producers panicked at first. They whispered behind clipboards, unsure if this uncontainable energy was genius or disaster. But ratings don't whisper. They roar. And within weeks, the roar became impossible to ignore. Viewers who had once watched Donahue religiously began switching channels. Housewives, dock workers, teachers, secretaries, grandparents. People on both sides of Chicago's fractured map. They tuned in not for spectacle, but for sincerity. They tuned in because Oprah saw them. By the second month, the station phones rang nonstop. Letters poured in. The audience began arriving hours early just to be in the same room as her. Something miraculous was happening. A failing show was transforming into a phenomenon. And it wasn't because of marketing or clever scripting. It was because Oprah was doing something radical. She was telling the truth out loud. Not just in content, but in presence. She carried the scars of Mississippi, the loneliness of Milwaukee, the discipline of Nashville. She carried the weight of every moment she had been told she was too emotional, too black, too heavy, too soft. And instead of hiding those wounds, she allowed them to become part of her voice. People didn't love her despite her vulnerability. They loved her because of it. And Donahue, once untouchable, unchallengeable, felt the shift like a cold wind. His numbers wavered, then dipped, then fell behind hers altogether. It didn't happen with fireworks. It happened with a quiet inevitability, the way dawn overtakes the night, not in a single burst, but in a gradual, unstoppable surge. One morning, an intern lushed into the studio holding the latest ratings. Her hands shook. Oprah took the paper, expecting the usual climb. But this wasn't a climb. This was a summit. AM Chicago had overtaken Donahue. The king had been dethroned.
There was no celebration in the studio that day. No champagne, no speech. Oprah simply sat in her dressing room, staring at the numbers. She did not smile immediately. She didn't cry. What she felt was something deeper than triumph. Recognition. The girl in the potato sack. The child who talked to cockroaches because no one else listened. The teenager who buried a baby alone. The woman who lost her hair on television. The anchor who failed in Baltimore. The host who was never meant to succeed in Chicago. She had outrun every expectation but her own. And somewhere in the quiet space between shock and gratitude, she whispered the truth she had always known. This is the beginning. Success has a strange way of rearranging the truth. By 1988, Oprah Winfrey was no longer the underdog from Chicago. She was the phenomenon who had rewritten the rules of daytime television. Her show reached millions. Her face had become part of the American household. She was adored, quoted, praised, studied. And yet, beneath the empire rising around her, something dark had begun to grow. Something small and unspoken, tightening like a knot beneath her skin. It started with a simple truth. America loved her, but America also judged her. Not for her mind, not for her brilliance, not for the way she could crack open a stranger's heart with a single question. They judged her body. She heard it in interviews, read it in columns, saw it in the way producers looked at her wardrobe. Weight, weight, weight. Always her weight. Every pound, every fluctuation, every rumor of a diet became news. At first, she told herself she didn't care. She was doing the work of her life. She was rising. But even rising is hard when the world is obsessed with gravity, specifically the gravity of your own flesh. Then came the idea. One doctor, one promise, one whispered suggestion that sounded like redemption. A liquid diet called OptiFast. Just calories, no chewing. Just measured cups, no pleasure. Just control, no freedom. The doctor told her she could lose the weight quickly, efficiently, publicly. And efficiency is seductive for a woman who has built her life on impossible deadlines. She said yes. At first, the hunger felt like noise, an irritation easily ignored. But hunger has patience. Hunger waits until you are tired, until you are stressed, until you are lonely. Then it speaks louder. By week 2, her stomach felt hollow enough to echo. By week 5, she caught herself staring too long at other people's plates. By month 2, she had stopped trusting herself to walk past a bakery window. And yet, the weight dropped, and the compliments arrived, and the producers smiled again, and the country whispered, "She's finally winning." Winning. As if thinness were the prize she had been chasing all her life. No one knew she was freezing at night because she didn't have enough body fat to stay warm. No one saw her lifting herself carefully from bed because her muscles trembled. No one watched her smile through dizziness on set. She was Oprah, so she smiled. And then November came. The jeans. The infamous size 10 Calvin Klein jeans. The pair she had bought not because she wanted to wear them, but because she wanted to prove to the world she could. She slid them on the morning of the broadcast and felt the denim close around her like a seal. A seal that said, "Now they'll love you. Now they'll be proud of you. Now you are enough." But her body disagreed. Her head throbbed. Her pulse fluttered weakly. Her stomach cramped from emptiness. Still, she walked to the studio. She was smaller than she had ever been, and somehow she had never felt heavier. Backstage, she could hear the audience chanting, stomping, building a frenzy she was meant to step into like a victorious gladiator. The red wagon, filled with 67 pounds of glistening animal fat, waited beside her. That wagon was supposed to symbolize triumph. What it symbolized instead was sacrifice. They rolled it out first. The audience gasped, then cheered, then roared. And finally, Oprah stepped into the lights. She smiled because that was the job. But inside her chest, something recoiled from the applause. She saw their eyes, wide, wild, intoxicated by the transformation. They weren't applauding her courage or her intellect or her years of work. They were applauding her thinness. For a moment, she wondered if this was what she had been reduced to, a number on a scale, a shrinking silhouette, a body subjected to public referendum. The audience rose to their feet. People cried. Women clutched their hearts. Men nodded in awe. She nodded back, gracious and glowing on camera.
But privately, she felt something cold settle inside her, a truth she wished she didn't know. The world loved her more when she was disappearing. That afternoon, she carried the show. She laughed, she explained the process, she inspired millions. She played the role perfectly. America saw motivation. America saw discipline. America did not see how many times she steadied herself backstage. America did not see her swallowing dizziness. America did not see the way hunger gnawed at her reasoning. That night, after the studio emptied, she went home alone. The jeans, still hugging her hips, felt like armor she could not remove. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the carpet until her vision blurred. She had given the world a miracle, but the miracle had taken something from her.
And the worst part was still coming. Within days, her body began reclaiming itself. A pound, then 2, then 5. Her metabolism, furious from starvation, surged. The weight she had lost in 4 months began returning like a tide she could not stop. The shame hit fast. The headlines came. The whispers returned. The world watched her expand again, as if her body were a public performance. And in the quiet, she asked herself a question she had never said aloud. Why does my worth rise and fall with the scale? Why isn't my mind enough? She had stood in front of millions looking like a champion, but inside she had been starving, physically, emotionally, spiritually. The wagon of fat had been her victory lap, but privately it was her surrender. She eventually regained the weight, but she did not regain her innocence. For the first time in her career, she understood something devastating.
The crown the world placed on her head was heavy, and the price they demanded for it was her body. The world believed they had witnessed a triumph. Oprah knew they had witnessed her hunger. And from that hunger, she learned a lesson that would shape the rest of her empire. If she did not reclaim the meaning of her own worth, the world would define it for her, and define it cruelly. Fame does not arrive as a thunderclap. It seeps in, quietly at first, then all at once, until the air you breathe is no longer your own. By the early 1990s, Oprah Winfrey had become one of the most recognizable women in America. Her show dominated daytime television. Her name circulated in living rooms, barbershops, kitchen tables, offices, buses, bookstores, everywhere. The empire was rising, and she, its architect, sat at the center of its expanding universe. But success has shadows, and the larger the spotlight, the darker the shadows become.
In those years, American television was undergoing a transformation. Ratings, those invisible numbers that determined the fate of careers, were becoming more ravenous, more unpredictable, more demanding. Producers across networks hunted for shock, for spectacle, for the kind of emotional chaos that made viewers stop mid-channel and stare. Trash TV was being born, and it was profitable. Jerry Springer roared onto screens with fistfights, betrayals, half-screamed confessions. Tabloid talk shows sprouted like weeds, feeding on dysfunction, feeding on desperation, feeding on the spectacle of human collapse. And underneath it all was a simple, brutal truth. Drama sold. Advertisers smiled. Executives cheered. Audiences gawked. Something primal had awakened in the culture, something hungry for spectacle and indifferent to dignity. And the pressure seeped in out every corner of the Oprah Winfrey Show. Her staff began bringing her topics that felt increasingly violent to the spirit. Family betrayals, cheating scandals, confrontations engineered for conflict. The show was still doing well, better than most, but the producers could feel the cultural tide shifting. They wanted to ride that tide before it pulled them under. More heat, they said. More shock. Give them something they can't look away from. At first, Oprah resisted silently. She knew the power of storytelling, but she also knew the cost of exploiting someone's pain for entertainment. Yet the numbers mattered, not just to the network, but to her entire staff. Dozens of people whose livelihoods depended on keeping the show at the top. So she allowed a few episodes, just a few, to drift closer to the sensationalism that dominated the era. The ratings rose, the applause grew louder, but inside, something began to wither. She felt it happening slowly, like erosion, a quiet ache each time she asked a question that felt beneath her, a weight in her chest whenever a segment leaned towards spectacle rather than truth, a sense of spiritual nausea when the audience gasped not with empathy, but delight at someone else's humiliation. One afternoon, she sat alone in her dressing room while the crew reset the studio. The hum of cameras drifted through the walls. The scent of makeup powder lingered in the air. She stared at her reflection, the expensive blouse, the perfect curls, the face of a woman America trusted implicitly. But her eyes looked tired. Not physically tired, soul tired. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from betraying yourself, even subtly, even in small increments. She had spent her childhood surviving environments that required silence, performance, obedience. She had promised herself adulthood would be different. Yet here she was, feeding an audience stories stripped of dignity, shaping pain into spectacle, encouraging a culture of voyeurism she did not believe in. That realization cut her deeply. The next day, she stepped onto the stage and saw her audience differently. They were not just viewers. They were consumers, hungry, expectant, waiting for the next emotional explosion. And she had been giving it to them. It was a moment that felt like stepping outside her own body. A moment stretched across time. A moment where she saw herself from the vantage point of her own regret. She watched the audience react to a guest's confession, eyes widening, bodies leaning forward, hearts pounding for entertainment. She watched them laugh at someone's heartbreak, gasp at someone's betrayal, revel in someone's shame. And she felt ill, not because of the audience, but because she had allowed this world to grow under her name. She walked off stage after the taping and went straight to her office, shutting the door behind her with a finality that echoed in her bones. She stood in the quiet room, staring at the shelves lined with awards, glittering symbols of recognition that suddenly felt weightless. Her life had been built on listening, on empathy, on connection. She had risen because she touched people, because she cared honestly, because she had turned her scars into a lantern for others. How had she drifted so far from that mission? She sat down heavily on the couch and buried her face in her hands. The thoughts came in waves, some sharp, some mournful. I am feeding them junk food for the soul. I am giving them empty calories. I am starving myself in a different way now. The golden cage did not look like punishment. It looked like success. It looked like awards, ratings, acclaim. It looked like everything she had once dreamed of, but inside, it was hollow. Success is not freedom when success requires self-betrayal. Success is not power when power demands a performance of someone you are not. Success is not victory when victory asks for your integrity as payment. She realized something that would change the trajectory of her life. She could not keep doing this. Not like this. Not at the cost of her spirit. She did not know how to fix it yet. She did not know where to start. She did not know whether her audience would follow her if she chose truth over spectacle. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. If she did not reclaim the show, she would lose herself inside it. And that was a price she refused to pay. The golden cage glittered. It shimmered. It seduced. But Oprah Winfrey had lived too many lives inside too many cages. Poverty, trauma, silence, expectation, to mistake gilded bars for freedom. She was ready to break the cage open, even if it cost her everything. The decision came not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet certainty, an ache of truth settling into her bones. Oprah had spent her childhood surviving other people's chaos. She would not spend her adulthood manufacturing it. She knew now that the golden cage glittered because it was designed to distract her from the truth.
that she had drifted far from the purpose that once gave her breath. Change did not come easily. Change rarely does when the world profits from your staying the same. The first conversation took place in a meeting room with fluorescent lights that hummed like an omen. Executives sat around the table, eyes sharp, hands folded. They had built careers on keeping ratings stable, on feeding viewers what they wanted, even if what they wanted was poison disguised as entertainment. Oprah told them she was done with trash TV. A few eyebrows lifted. Some faces tightened. One producer gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Oprah, this is what sells," he said. "This is what America wants." She held her ground. "It's not what I want." That sentence, spoken calmly and without apology, shifted the air in the room. One executive leaned back in his chair, studying her as if she had suddenly become a stranger. "Do you understand the risk?" he asked. "If we walk away from conflict, from scandal, if we go soft, you could lose everything. The ratings, the network, the power you built. People change the channel fast." She knew he was right. She also knew none of it mattered. For years, she had looked into the eyes of her audience and believed she was feeding them connection. But she had seen the truth now. She had been giving them noise. She had been numbing them, not nourishing them. And she could not unsee it. So she nodded slowly, then let them change the channel. The room fell into a stunned silence, because they understood the stakes, even if she didn't say them out loud. This decision wasn't a rebranding. It was an act of rebellion. It was an act of spiritual defiance, and it would cost her. When the first episodes of her new direction aired, the shift was immediate. Gone were the brawling families, the salacious confessions, the theatrics. In their place, she brought something quieter, something riskier, meaning. Conversations about healing, books, forgiveness, spiritual growth. Topics that asked her audience not just to watch, but to engage, to reflect, to rise. The backlash came quickly. Advertisers called, nervous. Critics sharpened their pens. Networks grumbled. One newspaper headline mocked her transformation. Oprah goes soft. Soft, as if empathy were weakness, as if wisdom were a liability, as if elevation could never compete with spectacle. She ignored it. For the first time since Chicago, she stopped chasing numbers. She chased truth instead. Some days the quiet in the studio felt punishing. The energy was different, the applause softer, the air heavier. She sensed doubt creeping among staff, threading its way through whispers in hallways. Is this really going to work? Has she lost her touch? Has she forgotten what the audience wants? But she held the wheel steady. She remembered Milwaukee. She remembered Baltimore. She remembered standing backstage, starving inside a pair of jeans that did not deserve her suffering. Each memory anchored her. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something extraordinary happened. The audience began to return. Not for chaos, not for cheap thrills, not for spectacle. They returned for themselves. They came seeking wisdom, seeking comfort, seeking the kind of nourishment they didn't know they had been missing until she offered it. Her studio once again became a gathering place, not for dysfunction, but for transformation. Then came the book club. It began as a small idea, almost an afterthought, a desire to share the books that had shaped her, freed her, steadied her. She held up a novel on air one afternoon and simply said, "Read this, trust me." What happened next rewrote publishing history. Bookstores were stormed, phones rang off the hook, publishers panicked to print more copies. Unknown authors became household names overnight. The Oprah Book Club became not just a segment, but a cultural force, an engine of empathy disguised as a reading list. She didn't just entertain her audience anymore. She educated them. She elevated them. She invited them to stretch the boundaries of their own inner lives. And the ratings, they didn't just recover, they soared. The advertisers returned, this time with softer voices. Critics reconsidered their earlier mockery. And Oprah, for the first time in years, felt alignment, a harmony between her mission and her platform. Her show became a lighthouse. People came to her not for spectacle, but for guidance, not for gossip,
but for growth. Not for distraction, but for meaning. And as the decade turned, the empire expanded. She launched a magazine, a production company, a school in South Africa, initiatives rooted not in fame, but in intention. Her wealth grew, billionaire wealth, yet she felt no hunger for more. Her hunger had changed. It no longer gnawed at her body. It lived in her spirit, urging her to serve, to uplift, to build. But every empire has a cost. Late at night, when the studio had emptied and the applause had faded, she would sit alone in her home, beautiful, quiet, echoing, and feel the outlines of the life she had sacrificed. She had a partner in Stedman, loyal and steady, but no wedding ring. She had nieces and nephews, godchildren and students, but no children of her own. Her show was her marriage. Her audience were her children. Her calling had become her home. Love, romantic, domestic, private, was the one realm she never fully entered. Not because she couldn't, because she chose not to split herself. The crown she wore demanded her whole heart, and she had given it without hesitation. Was it worth it? In her quietest moments, she answered herself honestly, yes. But the price was real, and she paid it every day. She had risen from a potato sack dress on a Mississippi farm to become the most trusted woman in American media. She had survived trauma, hunger, humiliation, and the crushing weight of expectation. She had found her voice, lost it, reclaimed it, and fortified it into a legacy. But crowns, no matter how bright, always leave a mark on the head that wears them. The world saw a queen. Oprah felt the weight of the kingdom. And yet she stood, steady, luminous, unbroken, not because the crown made her powerful, but because she had forged the power long before the crown ever touched her head. She had never been searching for fame. She had been searching for meaning. And in giving meaning to millions, she had finally found her own.